I'm Emma Rodriguez, 26 years old, and I'll never forget the look on my family's faces when they realized that the crumpled dollar bill they'd been laughing about for months was actually the key to a fortune they never imagined existed. Standing in that sterile conference room at Credit Suisse in Geneva, watching Miss Claire Hoffman's hands tremble as she opened safety deposit box number 4847, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness wash over me. My family had spent decades treating me like the failure, the disappointment, the one who couldn't get her life together. They had no idea that Abuela Sofia, the woman they barely acknowledged at family gatherings, had left me something that would change everything they thought they knew about success, about worth, and about the quiet seamstress who had watched them all from the corner of the room with knowing eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Rodriguez family hierarchy was as predictable as Chicago winter, and just as brutal. Growing up in our pristine Victorian house on North Cleveland Avenue, everyone knew exactly where they stood in the pecking order. My older brother, Michael, held the crown as the golden child, Harvard Law School graduate turned corporate attorney at one of Chicago's most prestigious firms. At 29, he was already making partner-track money, driving a BMW, and living in a downtown high-rise that our parents bragged about to anyone who would listen. Then there was Jessica, my younger sister, the medical prodigy who had sailed through Northwestern University and was now in her third year of medical school. At 23, she was already being courted by residency programs across the country, her future as bright and certain as the diplomas that lined our hallway wall. And then there was me, Emma, the art history major who worked at Grind Coffee House in Wicker Park, serving lattes to hipsters and tourists, while trying to figure out what to do with a degree that everyone reminded me was essentially worthless. I lived in a studio apartment that was smaller than my parents' walk-in closet, took the L to work every day, and had a checking account that rarely saw more than 3 digits. In a family obsessed with traditional markers of success, I was the cautionary tale, the example of what happened when you followed your dreams instead of practical career advice. Our weekly family dinners were exercises in subtle humiliation that had been perfected over years of practice. Every Sunday at 6 sharp, we would gather around the mahogany dining table that my mother Linda had inherited from her grandmother, and the performance would begin. Dad would ask about everyone's week, starting with Michael's latest courtroom victory or important client meeting. Mom would beam with pride as he described his cases, his billable hours, his growing reputation in the legal community. Then attention would turn to Jessica, who would share updates about her rotations, her research projects, her professors who were impressed with her dedication and natural talent for diagnostics. By the time they got to me, the energy in the room would shift like air being let out of a balloon. "What about you, Emma?" Dad would ask with the kind of forced cheerfulness that barely concealed his disappointment. "How are things at the coffee shop? Any thoughts about using that expensive education we paid for?" I would mumble something about the regulars, about how I was still exploring my options, about maybe applying for museum internships, and I could see the barely concealed eye rolls, the tight smiles, the way the conversation would quickly pivot to more successful family members. Uncle Tom and Aunt Carol would often join these dinners, bringing their son David, who was Michael's age, and worked as an investment banker downtown. Tom owned a chain of auto dealerships across the Chicago suburbs, and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone about his financial success. He would arrive in his latest luxury car, talk about his vacation homes, his golf club memberships, his son's impressive portfolio performance. The message was always clear: success was measured in dollars, status symbols, and prestigious job titles. Everything I lacked. The worst part wasn't even the direct criticism, it was the casual way they would talk about me as if I wasn't there, or as if my potential was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be supported. "Emma's always been the artistic one," Mom would say to guests, as if artistry was a diagnosis rather than a passion. "We keep hoping she'll find her direction," Dad would add, the implication being that 26 was far too old to still be searching. David would occasionally throw me a bone, asking about my photography or whether I'd been to any interesting gallery openings, but even his well-meaning questions felt like charity, from the successful cousin to the family disappointment. But there was one person who never made me feel like a failure, who never questioned my choices, or made me feel small for working in a coffee shop, while my siblings collected professional accolades. Abuela Sofia had been a constant presence in my childhood, a tiny woman with silver hair always pulled back in a neat bun, who spoke in a mixture of Spanish and English, and had hands that told stories of decades spent working with needle and thread. She had immigrated to Chicago from Spain in 1954, when she was just 18 years old, and had worked as a seamstress her entire life, taking in alterations and mending clothes for neighbors in the Pilsen neighborhood, where she lived in a small apartment above a bakery. While my parents and siblings barely acknowledged her presence at family gatherings, I had always been drawn to her quiet strength and the way she seemed to see the world differently than everyone else. She would sit in the corner during our loud family dinners, watching everything with dark eyes that missed nothing, occasionally making observations in Spanish that would make me laugh even when I didn't fully understand the word. When I was little, she would take me to the small balcony of her apartment and point out constellations, telling me stories about the stars that connected our family to places I had never seen, to history I had never learned in school. Para mi nieta especial, she would say, calling me her special granddaughter. You have eyes that see what others miss. This is gift, not curse. She would tell me about the old country, about castles and olive groves, about family recipes and traditions that had been passed down through generations. Most of the family dismissed these stories as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman, but I hung on every word, sensing that there was something important in these tales that I was too young to fully understand. As I got older and the family pressure to succeed in traditional ways intensified, Abuela Sofia became my refuge. I would visit her apartment on weekends, helping her with groceries, or just sitting with her while she worked on her sewing project. She would ask about my photography, about the art classes I had taken, about my dreams of maybe working in a museum or gallery someday. She never asked when I was going to get a real job, or why I wasn't more like my sibling. Instead, she would nod thoughtfully and say things like, "The most beautiful treasures are often hidden where people don't think to look." When Abuela Sofia passed away 3 months ago, the family's grief was polite but measured. She had been 99 years old, had lived a full life, and had died peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was small, held at the Catholic Church in Pilsen, where she had attended Mass every Sunday for 65 years. My parents handled the arrangements efficiently. My siblings sent flowers and attended the service, but I was the one who had spent her final weeks visiting her in the hospital, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness, listening to her whispered stories about treasures and stars and the importance of patience. The will reading was scheduled for a Saturday morning in early October, held in the conference room of Peterson and Associates, the family law firm that had handled Abuela's simple estate planning. I had taken the morning off from the coffee shop, something that my manager wasn't thrilled about during the busy fall season when tourists flocked to Wicker Park to see the changing leaves. I arrived at the downtown office building still wearing my work clothes, jeans, and a sweater that had seen better days, feeling underdressed compared to my family members who had shown up in their professional attire. Mr. Henry Peterson was a kind man in his 70s, who had handled legal matters for our family for decades. He had known Abuela Sofia since she had first arrived in Chicago, had helped her with immigration paperwork, lease agreements, and eventually with writing her will. He greeted each of us warmly, offering coffee and expressing his condolences once more before settling behind his desk with a folder containing the documents that would reveal how Abuela had chosen to distribute her modest possession. The reading began with the standard legal language, the formal acknowledgement of Sofia Elena Rodriguez's passing, and her desire to distribute her worldly possessions to her surviving family members. Mr. Peterson adjusted his glasses and began reading the specific bequest. To her son Robert, my father, she left her collection of family photographs and her rosary beads. To her daughter-in-law Linda, she left her jewelry box and the few pieces of costume jewelry it contained. To her grandson Michael, she left her father's pocket watch, a tarnished piece that had belonged to her father in Spain. To her granddaughter Jessica, she left her collection of recipe cards and the cast-iron skillet that had belonged to her own grandmother. As Miss Peterson continued reading, I noticed the pattern. Each bequest was personal, meaningful, but not particularly valuable in monetary terms. My parents exchanged glances, and I could see them calculating the worth of what they were hearing. Abuela's apartment had been modest, her possessions few, and while the sentimental value of these items was clear, no one was expecting any significant financial inheritance. She had worked as a seamstress her entire life, had lived frugally, and had never displayed any signs of hidden wealth. When Mr. Peterson reached my name, I sat up straighter in my chair, curious about what Abuela had chosen to leave me. To my granddaughter Emma Sofia Rodriguez, he read, I leave the sum of $1, along with this note, to be given to her exactly as I have written it. He reached into the folder and pulled out a small envelope with my name written on it in Abuela's careful handwriting. Inside was a crisp $1 bill, and a piece of paper with a message written in her mixture of Spanish and English. Para mi nieta especial. The key to everything is where we used to count stars. Remember what I taught you about looking beyond what others see. The treasure is not always where people expect to find it. The room fell silent for a moment, before my Uncle Tom let out a short laugh. $1? That's it? My dad cleared his throat uncomfortably, and my mom reached over to pat my hand in what I assume was meant to be a comforting gesture. I'm sure she meant well, honey, Mom said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was trying to make the best of an embarrassing situation. Maybe she was confused at the end, or maybe there's more to it that we don't understand yet. But even as my family began to discuss the possibility that Abuela had made a mistake, that perhaps her advanced age had affected her judgment, I found myself staring at the note and remembering those evenings on her balcony, looking up at the stars while she told me stories about hidden treasures and the importance of patience. The key to everything is where we used to count stars. I knew exactly what she meant. Her balcony where we had spent so many evenings together, where she had shared her stories about the old country and the treasures that had been hidden away for safekeeping. The will reading concluded with Miss Peterson explaining the practical matters of estate settlement, the transfer of possessions, and the small amount of money in Abuela's checking account that would be used to cover final expenses. My family members began discussing among themselves who would handle which responsibilities, who would clean out her apartment, who would distribute the various bequests. I sat quietly, folding the dollar bill and the note carefully and putting them in my purse, already planning my visit to Abuela's apartment. That evening our family gathered for dinner as usual, but the conversation was dominated by discussion of the inheritance and what it revealed about Abuela's final wishes. Michael was pleased with the pocket watch which he planned to have restored and perhaps use as a conversation piece in his office. Jessica was excited about the recipe cards, planning to try some of Abuela's. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Traditional Spanish dish. My parents were gracious about their bequests, though I could sense their slight disappointment that there hadn't been more monetary value in the estate. And then the conversation turned to Emma got $1, Tom said with a chuckle, still apparently finding humor in what he saw as an odd bequest. Maybe it was her way of telling you to save your money, he added, and the others laughed politely. I think it's sweet, Carol said, though her tone suggested she found it more pitiful than sweet. She probably knew that Emma needed every dollar she could get, what with the coffee shop job and all. David tried to be supportive, suggesting that maybe the note contained some kind of clue or deeper meaning, but even his well-intentioned comments felt like consolation prizes. I excused myself early that evening, claiming I had to work the opening shift at the coffee shop the next morning. But instead of going home to my studio apartment, I drove to Pilsen, to the small building where Abuela had lived for the last 30 years of her life. The landlord, Miss Martinez, had given me a key weeks earlier, knowing that I would be the one to handle the personal belongings and prepare the apartment for the next tenant. I climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, unlocked the door, and stepped into the space that had been Abuela's home for so many years. The apartment was exactly as she had left it, small and neat, with furniture that had been carefully maintained, but was clearly decades old. The walls were covered with photographs of family, religious imagery and a few small paintings that she had collected over the year. The kitchen was tiny but functional, with the cast iron skillet that now belonged to Jessica sitting on the stove, and the recipe cards that contained her culinary secrets, organized in a small wooden box on the counter. Everything spoke of a life lived simply without excess, but with careful attention to the things that mattered most. I made my way to the small balcony that had been our stargazing spot, stepping out into the cool October evening air. The city lights made it difficult to see the stars as clearly as we had when I was a child, but I could still make out the major constellations that Abuela had taught me to identify. I stood there for a few minutes, holding the dollar bill and the note, trying to understand what she had meant by the key to everything is where we used to count stars. As I looked around the balcony, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. In the corner behind a small potted plant that had long since died, there was a loose brick in the wall. It was barely noticeable, just slightly proud of the surrounding bricks, but when I pushed on it gently, it moved. Behind the brick was a small cavity, and inside that cavity was a key. Not a house key or a car key, but an old-fashioned key that looked like it belonged to a safety deposit box, with a small metal tag attached that had a number engraved on it, 4847. My heart started beating faster as I realized what I was holding. This wasn't just any key. This was the key that Abuela had referred to in her note, the key to everything. But what did it unlock? The metal tag suggested it was for a safety deposit box. And how had my family's elderly seamstress grandmother, who had lived paycheck to paycheck her entire life, come to possess a safety deposit box key hidden behind a brick on her balcony? I spent the next hour searching through Abuela's apartment more carefully, looking for any clues about what the key might unlock. In her bedroom, I found a small wooden box tucked away in the back of her closet. Inside were documents I had never seen before, old photographs of people I didn't recognize, letters written in Spanish, and what appeared to be official paperwork from various banks and institutions. Most of the documents were in Spanish, and many were quite old, but as I looked through them carefully, I began to piece together a picture of Abuela's life that was completely different from what I had always understood. There were letters from Spain, dating back to the 1950s, that mentioned property and family possessions that had been left behind when she emigrated. There were bank statements from institutions I had never heard of, including what appeared to be correspondence from a Swiss bank. And there were photographs of a large house with extensive grounds, with people dressed in fine clothing, who bore a striking resemblance to my grandmother, but in a setting that suggested wealth and privilege rather than the modest working-class life she had lived in Chicago. As I continued to search through the documents, I found a letter written in English, apparently intended for me, tucked inside an old Bible that had been her constant companion. The letter was dated just 6 months before her death, and it was addressed to mi nieta especial, her special granddaughter. In it she explained that she had been saving this revelation for the right time, and that she had chosen me as the one to receive it, because I was the only one in the family who had ever shown genuine interest in her stories about the old country and the treasures that had been hidden away. The letter explained that her family in Spain had been wealthy landowners, who had been forced to flee during the Spanish Civil War, taking with them only what they could carry and hiding the rest for future retrieval. She had been just 18 when she arrived in Chicago, carrying with her not just the hope of starting a new life, but also the knowledge of where certain family treasures had been hidden and the legal documents that proved her claim to them. Over the years she had worked not just as a seamstress, but as a careful investor and saver, slowly building a portfolio that would allow her to eventually reclaim what had been left behind. The letter contained instructions for accessing a safety deposit box at Credit Suisse in Geneva, Switzerland, using the key I had found hidden behind the brick. It also contained contact information for a lawyer in Switzerland, who had been helping her with the legal processes of reclaiming her family's assets, and bank account information that suggested she had been far more financially sophisticated than any of us had realized. The woman who had clipped coupons and shopped at thrift stores had apparently been managing international investments and legal claims for decades, all while maintaining the appearance of a simple immigrant seamstress. As I sat in her small apartment, surrounded by the modest possessions that had defined her public life, I began to understand the magnitude of what she had entrusted to me. The dollar bill hadn't been a pittance or a mistake. It had been a symbol, a reminder that the most valuable things in life are often hidden behind the most humble appearance. She had spent her entire adult life building toward this moment, carefully preserving and growing a legacy that she had chosen to pass on to the granddaughter who had been willing to listen to her stories and see beyond the surface of things. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching everything I could about the documents I had found. I contacted the Swiss lawyer whose information was in Abuela's letter, and after providing proof of my identity and her death certificate, I learned that she had indeed been working with his firm for over 40 years to reclaim assets that had been left behind when her family fled Spain. The safety deposit box in Geneva contained not just documents and family heirlooms, but also the proceeds from properties that had been recovered and sold, investments that had been growing for decades, and artifacts that had been carefully preserved for future generations. The lawyer, Mr. Weber, explained that the total value of what was in the safety deposit box was difficult to estimate without a full appraisal, but that preliminary assessments suggested it could be worth several $1,000,000. He arranged for me to access the box via video conference initially, with the option to travel to Geneva to claim the contents in person once I had seen what was inside and decided how to proceed. The video call was scheduled for the following week, and I spent the intervening days in a state of stunned disbelief. I continued to work at the coffee shop, serving lattes and trying to process the reality that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even imagine. I didn't tell anyone in my family what I had discovered, partly because I wasn't sure they would believe me, and partly because I wanted to understand the full scope of what Abuela had left me before I shared the news with people who had spent my entire life treating me as the family disappointment. When the day of the video conference arrived, I was sitting in my small studio apartment, laptop open, heart pounding as Miss Claire Hoffman, the bank manager at Credit Suisse, greeted me from her office in Geneva. She had been expecting my call, having worked with Abuela's lawyer for many years on the management of the assets she had deposited. After verifying my identity and reviewing the legal documents that proved my right to access the box, she took me on a virtual tour of safety deposit box. What I saw in that box changed everything I thought I knew about my family, about wealth, about the power of patience and careful planning. There were jewels that had belonged to Spanish nobility, artwork that had been hidden during the war, gold coins that had been collected over centuries, and documents that proved my family's claim to properties and assets that had been recovered after decades of legal battle. There were also more recent additions, stock certificates, bond documents and bank statements that showed Abuela had been a shrewd investor who had turned her modest seamstress earnings into a substantial portfolio over the course of 65 years. The total value, Hoffman explained, was approximately $42 million, not including several pieces of artwork and jewelry that would require professional appraisal to determine their full worth. My grandmother, the woman my family had barely acknowledged, the immigrant seamstress who had lived in a tiny apartment and worked her entire life with her hands, had been quietly building a fortune that would make her the wealthiest person in our family by far. As I stared at the screen, looking at treasures that had been hidden for over half a century, I understood why Abuela had chosen me to receive this inheritance. It wasn't just about the money, although the financial freedom it would provide was beyond anything I had ever imagined. It was about the recognition that I was the one who had been willing to listen to her stories, to see value in things that others dismissed, to understand that the most important treasures are often hidden in plain sight. The irony wasn't lost on me, that my family, who had spent years criticizing my lack of traditional success, had completely missed the fact that the most successful person among us had been sitting quietly in the corner the entire time, watching and waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth about what real wealth looked like. The week following my video conference with Miss Hoffman felt like living in two different worlds simultaneously. During the day, I continued my routine at Grind Coffee House, steaming milk and taking orders from the usual mix of college students and neighborhood regulars, all while carrying the secret that I was now worth more than everyone in my family combined. The weight of this knowledge was both exhilarating and terrifying. I found myself making mistakes I never made before, burning espresso shots and forgetting orders, my mind constantly wandering to the implications of what I had discovered. My manager Tony noticed my distraction but attributed it to grief over losing my grandmother. He was a kind man in his 50s, who had been running the coffee shop for over a decade, and he had always been understanding about my need for flexible scheduling around family obligations. "Emma, take the weekend off," he said on Friday afternoon, after I had accidentally given a customer oat milk instead of regular milk for the third time that week. "You've been through a lot recently, and you need some time to process everything." I thanked him, knowing that the processing I needed to do was far more complex than he could imagine. That evening, I sat in my studio apartment with all of Abuela's documents spread across my small dining table, trying to piece together the full scope of what she had accomplished. The letters from Spain painted a picture of a family that had been prominent in their region before the war, owners of extensive olive groves and a small but prosperous textile business. The photographs showed a grand house with multiple stories, ornate balconies and grounds that stretched as far as the eye could see. These weren't the images of poverty that had shaped my understanding of my family's history, but rather evidence of a prosperity that had been lost, and then, through Abuela's patient work, partially reclaimed. The financial documents were even more revealing. Bank statements from Credit Suisse showed regular deposits dating back to 1956, just 2 years after Abuela's arrival in Chicago. The amounts were small at first, often just $10 or $20, but they were consistent month after month, year after year. As time went on, the deposits grew larger, and there were also records of stock purchases, bond investments, and real estate transactions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of financial markets that completely contradicted the image of a simple seamstress struggling to make ends meet. What struck me most was the methodical nature of her approach. Every document was carefully organized, every transaction recorded, every legal proceeding meticulously documented. She had been working with the Swiss law firm for over 40 years, slowly navigating the complex international legal system to reclaim properties that had been seized during the war. Some of these efforts had been successful, resulting in monetary settlements that she had immediately reinvested. Others were still in progress at the time of her death, meaning that my inheritance might continue to grow even beyond what I had already seen. The most moving discovery was a journal she had kept, written in Spanish, that documented her thoughts and feelings about this lifelong project. I had taken Spanish in high school and college, but her handwriting was challenging, and many of the expressions she used were regional dialects that I had to research online. As I slowly translated entries from different periods of her life, I began to understand not just what she had accomplished, but why she had chosen to live the way she had. In one entry from 1967, she wrote about watching my father graduate from high school and feeling proud of his achievements while also feeling the weight of the secret she carried. She expressed her hope that someday she would be able to share the truth about their family's heritage, but also her fear that her American-born children and grandchildren would not understand the importance of preserving these connections to the past. She wrote about the difficulty of living modestly while managing significant assets, about the loneliness of carrying such a large secret, and about her determination to ensure that the sacrifices of her parents and grandparents would not be forgotten. Another entry from 1985 described her decision to begin teaching me about the stars and telling me stories about the old country. She had apparently been watching all of her grandchildren, trying to determine which of us would be most likely to appreciate and properly manage the inheritance she was building. She wrote about Michael's focus on immediate success and status, about Jessica's dedication to her studies but lack of interest in family history, and about my willingness to listen to her stories and ask questions about traditions and memories that others found boring or irrelevant. The final entry, written just a month before her death, was perhaps the most profound. She wrote about her decision to leave me the dollar bill and the cryptic note, explaining that she wanted to test whether I would be curious enough to pursue the mystery and patient enough to uncover the truth. She expressed her confidence that I would find the key and discover what she had spent her lifetime building, and her hope that I would use the inheritance not just for personal benefit, but to honor the memory of family members who had given their lives to preserve what they could of their legacy. As I read these entries, I realized that Abuela had been preparing me for this moment for years without my knowing it. The stories she had told me about hidden treasures weren't just family folklore, but careful instruction about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. The patience she had taught me while we looked at the stars together was preparation for the patience I would need to navigate the complex legal and financial systems that she had mastered over decades. Even her insistence that I learn some Spanish, despite my parents' focus on assimilation and moving forward rather than looking back, had been part of a larger plan to ensure that I would be able to understand and appreciate the full scope of what she was leaving me. The more I learned about her accomplishments, the more I understood how completely my family had misunderstood her. She hadn't been the poor immigrant who needed their charity and occasional attention. She had been the most successful person in our family, building wealth and reclaiming heritage while maintaining the appearance of humble poverty. Her thrift store shopping hadn't been born of necessity but of choice, a way to keep her expenses low while maximizing her investment. Her small apartment hadn't been a sign of failure but of priorities, choosing to live simply so that she could build something greater for future generations. By Sunday evening, I had made my decision. I would tell my family about the inheritance, but not in the way they expected. I would attend our weekly family dinner as usual, let them continue their familiar patterns of condescension and disappointment, and then reveal the truth in a way that would make them understand, not just what they had missed about Abuela, but what they had missed about me as well. That Sunday dinner started exactly as I had anticipated. I arrived at my parents' house on North Cleveland Avenue wearing my usual weekend attire, jeans and a vintage sweater that I had found at a thrift store, carrying a bottle of wine that cost less than $20. Michael was already there, dressed in casual clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent, talking about a case he was working on that involved a major corporate acquisition. Jessica arrived shortly after I did, fresh from a study session at the medical library, full of stories about her clinical rotations and the attending physicians who were impressed with her diagnostic skills. The conversation during dinner followed the predictable pattern. Dad asked about Michael's work, and my brother launched into a detailed description of his latest billable hour achievements and the partnership track he was on. Mom beamed with pride as he described the respect he was earning from senior partners and the complex cases he was being assigned. Jessica shared updates about her research project and the possibility of publishing her findings in a medical journal, while Uncle Tom and Aunt Carol nodded approvingly and made comments about how proud they were of their accomplished nieces and nephews. When the conversation turned to me, I could see the familiar shift in energy around the table. "So Emma," Dad said with forced enthusiasm, "how are things at the coffee shop? Any interesting developments in your career plan?" I smiled and gave my usual non-committal responses about enjoying the work and keeping my options open. Tom chimed in with his standard suggestion that I should consider taking some business classes and maybe looking into management opportunities in the food service industry. "After all," he said, "there's good money to be made in hospitality if you're willing to work your way up." The conversation about Abuela's inheritance came up naturally, as I had expected it would. Michael mentioned that he had taken the pocket watch to a jeweler to have it appraised and cleaned, and that while it wasn't particularly valuable, it was a nice piece with some historical significance. Jessica had tried several of the recipes from Abuela's collection and was planning to frame some of the handwritten cards as kitchen decoration. The tone was affectionate but slightly condescending, as if they were humoring an elderly woman's sentimental attachments rather than truly valuing what she had left them. And then Tom brought up my inheritance, chuckling as he repeated the story of the dollar bill and the cryptic note. "We still can't figure out what the old lady was thinking," he said, addressing the table as if I wasn't there. "Maybe she was trying to teach Emma about the value of money, or maybe she was just confused at the end. Either way, it's a sweet gesture, even if it's not particularly practical." The others laughed politely and I could see them exchanging glances that suggested they felt sorry for me, the granddaughter who had received the least valuable inheritance from a grandmother who apparently hadn't had much to give. I let the conversation continue for a few more minutes, listening to their theories about Abuela's mental state, and their gentle suggestions that I shouldn't read too much into what was probably just an elderly woman's confused attempt at sentiment. Then I excused myself from the table, saying I needed to get something from my car. Instead, I retrieved the folder I had prepared, containing copies of some of the documents I had found and printed screenshots from my video conference with Ms. Hoffman at Credit Suisse. When I returned to the dining room, I placed the folder on the table and sat down, waiting for the conversation to pause. "I think you're right that Abuela was trying to teach me something about the value of money," I said, my voice calm and steady. "But I don't think she was confused at all. In fact, I think she was probably the most financially sophisticated person this family has ever known." The table went quiet, and I could see the puzzled expressions on their faces as they tried to understand what I was suggesting. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a bank statement from Credit Suisse, showing the current balance of safety deposit box 40. "This is from the Swiss bank where Abuela maintained an account for over 60 years, I explained. "The dollar bill she left me came with a note that led me to a key, and that key opened a safety deposit box containing assets worth approximately $4.2 million. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced in our family's dining room. Michael was the first to speak, his voice uncertain as he asked if this was some kind of joke. Jessica leaned forward to look at the bank statement more closely, her medical training making her naturally analytical about evidence and documentation. Mom and Dad sat frozen, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Tom and Carol exchanged glances that suggested they were trying to determine whether this was an elaborate prank or some kind of misunderstanding. I continued to pass around documents, explaining what I had discovered about Abuela's background and the decades-long project she had undertaken to reclaim her family's lost asset. I showed them photographs of the Spanish estate where she had grown up, letters from lawyers documenting successful property recoveries, and investment statements showing the careful growth of her portfolio over more than half a century. With each piece of evidence, I watched their understanding shift from disbelief to amazement, to something that looked almost like fear. The questions came in rapid succession. How long had I known about this? Why hadn't Abuela told anyone else? What did this mean for the rest of the family? How was it possible that a seamstress had accumulated such wealth? I answered each question patiently, explaining the timeline of my discovery, sharing what I had learned about Abuela's careful planning and patient investment strategy, and describing the legal processes that had been necessary to reclaim assets that had been lost during the Spanish Civil War. But the most difficult question came from my mother, who asked why Abuela had chosen to leave this inheritance to me rather than distributing it among all of her grandchildren. I had anticipated this question, and I had prepared an answer based on what I had learned from Abuela's journal and letters. She was looking for someone who would understand the importance of preserving family history and heritage, I explained. Someone who would appreciate the stories and the struggle that went into building this legacy. She chose me because I was the one who listened to her stories, who asked questions about our family's past, who showed interest in the culture and traditions that she was trying to preserve. The implication was clear, though I didn't state it directly. While they had been dismissing Abuela as a confused elderly woman and me as the family disappointment, she had been observing all of us and making careful judgments about who would be the most responsible steward of what she had spent her lifetime building. She had chosen the granddaughter who worked in a coffee shop over the grandson who was a successful lawyer and the granddaughter who was becoming a doctor, because she had seen something in me that they had never recognized. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had as a family. For the first time in my adult life, I found myself in the position of being the one with the most significant news, the most impressive accomplishment, the most substantial assets. The dynamic that had defined our family relationships for decades was suddenly completely reversed. Michael, who had always been the golden child, was asking me for advice about financial planning and investment strategies. Jessica, who had always been praised for her intelligence and dedication, was asking me about the legal processes involved in international asset recovery. Mom and Dad were struggling to reconcile this new information with their long-standing assumptions about both Abuela and me. They asked detailed questions about the Swiss bank, about the lawyers who had been handling the case, about the timeline for accessing the inheritance. They seemed genuinely amazed by the scope of what Abuela had accomplished, but also somewhat embarrassed by their failure to recognize her achievements during her lifetime. Uncle Tom's response was perhaps the most revealing. As a successful businessman who had always prided himself on his financial acumen, he was particularly struck by the sophistication of Abuela's investment strategy. He asked to see more of the documentation, studying the bank statements and investment records with the attention of someone who understood the skill and patience required to build such a portfolio. "I think we all underestimated your grandmother," he said finally, his voice carrying a tone of respect that I had never heard him use when talking about abuela before. The evening concluded with a family discussion about practical matters. I would need to travel to Geneva to formally claim the inheritance and decide how to manage the assets going forward. There would be tax implications to consider, legal processes to navigate, and decisions to make about how to honor abuela's legacy, while also using the inheritance to build a meaningful life for myself. For the first time in my adult life, my family members were asking for my thoughts and opinions, rather than offering unsolicited advice about my choices and prospects. As I prepared to leave that evening, carrying the folder of documents that had transformed our family's understanding of both abuela and me, I reflected on the magnitude of what had changed. The dollar bill that they had mocked for months had indeed been the key to everything. Just as abuela had intended, she had spent decades building a legacy that would not only provide financial security for her chosen heir, but also serve as a powerful lesson about the dangers of judging people by appearances, rather than understanding their true capabilities and contribution. The week that followed was a whirlwind of activity. I arranged to take extended leave from the coffee shop, explaining to Tony that I had inherited some family assets that required immediate attention. I contacted Miss Leverth, a Swiss lawyer, to arrange for my travel to Geneva and to begin the process of formally claiming the inheritance. I also reached out to financial advisors and tax attorneys in Chicago to ensure that I would be properly prepared for the legal and financial responsibilities that came with suddenly acquiring substantial wealth. The most surreal aspect of this period was the complete transformation in how my family treated me. Phone calls that had previously been brief and somewhat awkward now stretched for hours as family members asked detailed questions about my plans and offered their assistance with various aspects of managing the inheritance. Michael, who had rarely shown interest in my life beyond polite family obligation, now called regularly to discuss investment strategies and legal consideration. Jessica, who had always been too busy with her medical studies to spend much time with me, now made time for long conversations about family history and the importance of preserving abuela's legacy. My parents' response was the most They were genuinely amazed by what I had discovered and proud of the way I had handled the situation, but they were also clearly struggling with guilt about their treatment of both abuela and me over the years. They had spent decades viewing abuela as a burden to be managed and me as a disappointment to be corrected, and now they were faced with the reality that they had completely misunderstood both of us. They offered to help with the practical aspects of managing the inheritance, but their offers came with an undertone of apology that suggested they were trying to make up for years of dismissive behavior. The trip to Geneva was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and I spent the intervening time preparing for what would be one of the most significant experiences of my life. I studied the documents abuela had left more carefully, trying to understand not just the financial aspects of the inheritance, but also the family history and cultural heritage that she had worked so hard to preserve. I practiced my Spanish, knowing that some of the legal documents would be in that language and wanting to be able to fully understand the significance of what I was claiming. When I finally boarded the plane to Geneva, I carried with me not just the legal documents necessary to claim the inheritance, but also a profound appreciation for the wisdom and patience that abuela had demonstrated throughout her life. She had understood that true wealth wasn't just about accumulating money, but about preserving family heritage, building something meaningful for future generations, and recognizing the potential in people that others might overlook. The dollar bill she had left me hadn't been an afterthought or a mistake. It had been a carefully planned test, designed to determine whether I was worthy of the trust she was placing in me. The meeting at Credit Suisse was formal but moving. Hoffman walked me through the contents of the safety deposit box in person, explaining the history of each item and the legal processes that had been necessary to recover them. There were jewels that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother, artwork that had been hidden during the war, and documents that proved my family's claim to properties that had been lost for decades. There were also more recent additions, including stock certificates and bonds that abuela had purchased over the years, demonstrating her understanding of both the importance of preserving the past and the necessity of building for the future. As I signed the documents that formally transferred ownership of these assets to me, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I had been the family disappointment, the coffee shop worker who couldn't seem to find her direction in life. Now I was the heir to a legacy that represented not just financial security, but also a profound connection to family history and cultural heritage that I had never fully understood. The transformation wasn't just about money, although the financial freedom was certainly life-changing. It was about recognition, validation, and the understanding that sometimes the most valuable things in life are hidden behind the most humble appearances. The return to Chicago marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, but also in my family's understanding of what success and worth really mean. I had learned that true wealth often comes from patience, persistence, and the willingness to see value where others see only modest circumstance. Abuela had spent her entire adult life building something meaningful while maintaining the appearance of simplicity, and in doing so, she had created a legacy that would provide not just financial security, but also important lessons about the power of quiet determination and the importance of preserving family heritage for future generations. 6 months after returning from Geneva, I found myself sitting in the corner office of a downtown Chicago high-rise, reviewing quarterly reports from the investment firm I had hired to manage Abuela's portfolio. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now holding meetings in buildings where my brother Michael worked, discussing financial strategies with advisors who charged more per hour than I used to make in a week at the coffee shop. The transformation had been gradual but profound, not just in my financial circumstances, but in how I viewed myself and how others viewed me. The inheritance had required careful management from the moment I returned to Chicago. The Swiss assets needed to be transferred to American banks, tax obligations had to be calculated and paid, and investment strategies had to be developed to preserve and grow the wealth that Abuela had spent decades accumulating. I had initially felt overwhelmed by the complexity of managing such substantial assets, but I quickly discovered that I had inherited more than just money from my grandmother. I had also inherited her patience, her attention to detail, and her instinct for making sound financial decisions. Working with financial advisors had been an education in itself. Many of them had initially treated me with barely concealed condescension, assuming that a 26-year-old former coffee shop worker would be easily manipulated or would make impulsive decisions with her newfound wealth. They had recommended flashy investments, expensive lifestyle upgrades, and aggressive strategies that would have generated substantial fees for their firms while putting my inheritance at risk. But I had learned from Abuela's example that true wealth building required patience and careful analysis rather than quick decisions and dramatic gestures. I had chosen instead to work with a smaller, more conservative firm that specialized in preserving family wealth across generations. The advisors there had been impressed by my questions about long-term sustainability, my interest in understanding the underlying fundamentals of potential investments, and my insistence on maintaining the same careful approach that had allowed Abuela to build her fortune over decades. They had helped me develop a strategy that would allow the inheritance to continue growing while providing me with the financial freedom to pursue meaningful work and contribute to causes that mattered to me. The first major decision I had made was about my living situation. I could have afforded to buy a mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood in Chicago, but instead I had chosen to purchase a modest but beautiful townhouse in Lincoln Park, not far from where my parents lived. The house was large enough to accommodate my growing collection of family documents and artifacts from the inheritance, but it wasn't ostentatious or designed to impress others. I had learned from Abuela that true security came from making wise choices rather than displaying wealth, and I wanted to honor that lesson in how I approached my new circumstances. The second major decision had been about my career. I had given notice at the coffee shop, but not to become a socialite or to live a life of leisure. Instead, I had used my newfound financial freedom to pursue the museum work I had always dreamed of, but never felt I could afford to chase. I had enrolled in a graduate program in museum studies and had begun volunteering at the Chicago History Museum, where my knowledge of Spanish language and culture, combined with my personal experience with family heritage preservation, had made me a valuable contributor to their immigration history exhibits. The work at the museum had been incredibly fulfilling in ways that went beyond the financial security the inheritance had provided. I was helping other families research their genealogies, assisting with exhibits that told the stories of immigrants who had come to Chicago with nothing but determination and hope, and contributing to the preservation of cultural heritage that might otherwise be lost. In many ways, I was continuing the work that Abuela had begun, helping to ensure that the stories and achievements of people who might be overlooked or undervalued would not be forgotten. My family's adjustment to my changed circumstances had been complex and sometimes uncomfortable. Michael had struggled the most with the reversal of our traditional roles. For nearly 30 years, he had been the successful one, the achiever, the family member whose accomplishments were celebrated and whose advice was sought. Now he found himself in the position of asking me for financial guidance and investment tips, a role reversal that challenged his sense of identity and his understanding of his place in the family hierarchy. Our relationship had gradually improved as we both learned to navigate this new dynamic. Michael had eventually admitted that he had always seen me as the family dreamer, someone who needed protection and guidance rather than someone who might have valuable insights to offer. The inheritance had forced him to reconsider not just his assumptions about me, but also his understanding of what success really meant. He had begun to appreciate that my willingness to listen to Abuela's stories and my interest in family history had been signs of wisdom rather than impracticality. Jessica's response had been different but equally challenging. As someone who had always been praised for her intelligence and analytical abilities, she had struggled to understand how she had missed the signs of Abuela's wealth and sophistication. She had begun to question her own judgment and her ability to read people and situations accurately. Our conversations about the inheritance had led to deeper discussions about the importance of humility, the dangers of making assumptions about others, and the value of looking beyond surface appearances. The relationship with my parents had been the most emotionally complex to navigate. They had been forced to confront the reality that they had spent decades misunderstanding both their own mother and their own daughter. The guilt they felt about their treatment of Abuela was compounded by their regret about the way they had consistently undermined my confidence and dismissed my potential. They had tried to make amends through increased attention and support, but their efforts were tinged with an awkwardness that suggested they were still struggling to fully accept the new reality. Uncle Tom and Aunt Carol had responded in characteristic fashion, immediately attempting to position themselves as advisors and mentors who could help me navigate my new wealth. Tom had offered to introduce me to his business contacts and had suggested various investment opportunities that would benefit his own enterprises. Carol had begun including me in her social circle, introducing me to other wealthy families and suggesting that I might want to join the charitable organizations where she served on board. I had politely declined most of these offers, preferring to build my own network of relationships and to choose my own philanthropic causes. I had learned from Abuela's example that true wealth came with responsibilities, and I wanted to ensure that my charitable giving was thoughtful and meaningful, rather than simply designed to enhance my social status. I had begun supporting organizations that worked with immigrant families, educational programs that helped first-generation college students, and cultural preservation initiatives that aligned with the values Abuela had instilled in me. The most unexpected aspect of my new circumstances had been the way they had changed my relationship with Chicago itself. Having grown up in the city, I had always taken for granted the cultural institutions, the neighborhoods, and the opportunities that surrounded me. Now, with the financial freedom to explore and contribute, I had begun to see the city through different eyes. I had become a patron of smaller museums and cultural centers, particularly those that focused on immigrant history and Latino culture. I had also begun to travel more extensively, visiting the places that Abuela had told me about in her stories, and gaining a deeper understanding of the heritage she had worked so hard to preserve. One of the most meaningful trips had been to Spain, where I had visited the region where Abuela had grown up and had met with distant relatives who still lived there. The family estate had been sold decades earlier, but the village where she had been born still existed, and there were people there who remembered her family and the circumstances that had forced them to leave during the war. These conversations had provided me with a deeper understanding of the courage and sacrifice that had been required for Abuela to build a new life in America while never forgetting her roots. The Spanish relatives had been amazed to learn about what Abuela had accomplished in Chicago and about the inheritance she had left me. They had shared family photographs and documents that complemented the materials I had inherited, and they had expressed their gratitude that she had found a way to preserve and pass on the family legacy, despite the challenges she had faced. These connections had made me realize that my inheritance wasn't just about money, or even about family history. It was about the responsibility to maintain connections across generations and across continents, to ensure that the sacrifices of previous generations weren't forgotten, and to build something meaningful for future generations. The legal processes involved in managing the inheritance had also been educational. Working with lawyers and financial advisors had taught me about estate planning, tax strategies, and the importance of protecting assets for future generations. I had begun to understand why Abuela had been so secretive about her wealth and so careful about her financial decisions. Managing substantial assets required not just intelligence and patience, but also discretion and the ability to distinguish between trustworthy advisors and those who were primarily interested in generating fees for themselves. I had also learned about the philanthropic opportunities that came with wealth. Abuela had been quietly charitable throughout her life, but she had focused on small, direct contributions to individuals and families in need, rather than large donations to established organizations. I had chosen to continue this tradition while also exploring more formal charitable giving that could have a broader impact. I had established a small foundation focused on supporting first-generation college students from immigrant families, providing scholarships and mentorship programs that would help them navigate the challenges I had faced in pursuing higher education. The foundation work had been particularly meaningful because it had allowed me to use my inheritance in ways that honored Abuela's values, while also addressing needs that I understood from personal experience. Many of the students I worked with reminded me of myself at their age, struggling to balance family expectations with personal dreams, trying to find their way in a world that often seemed designed for people with different backgrounds and advantages. Being able to provide them with financial support and guidance felt like a natural extension of the lessons Abuela had taught me about recognizing potential in people who might be overlooked by others. The most challenging aspect of managing the inheritance had been learning to navigate the social dynamics that came with wealth. Chicago's philanthropic community was small and interconnected, and my sudden appearance as a significant donor had attracted attention from various organizations and individuals who were interested in cultivating relationships with me. I had to learn to distinguish between genuine interest in the causes I supported and opportunistic attempts to gain access to my resources. This process had given me a new appreciation for the wisdom Abuela had shown in maintaining her privacy and living modestly despite her wealth. She had understood that displaying wealth often attracted the wrong kind of attention, and that true security came from making careful choices about whom to trust, rather than from trying to impress others with expensive possessions or lavish lifestyle choices. I had tried to follow her example, focusing on building meaningful relationships and contributing to worthwhile causes, rather than seeking recognition or status. The inheritance had also changed my perspective on work and career development. Having financial security had allowed me to pursue my interests in museum studies and cultural preservation, without worrying about salary requirements or career advancement timelines. I had been able to take on challenging projects and volunteer positions that might not have been financially viable when I was supporting myself entirely through my coffee shop wages. This freedom had enabled me to develop skills and expertise that would have been difficult to acquire if I had been focused primarily on earning a living. At the same time, I had discovered that meaningful work was even more important when financial necessity wasn't a driving factor. The inheritance had given me the freedom to choose how to spend my time and energy, but it had also created a responsibility to use those choices wisely. I had learned that true fulfillment came not from having wealth, but from using wealth to contribute to something larger than myself and to honor the sacrifice and wisdom of those who had come before me. The experience had also taught me about the importance of maintaining perspective and humility despite changed circumstance. The inheritance had provided me with opportunities and advantages that most people would never have, but it had also created obligations and responsibilities that required careful consideration. I had learned that privilege came with the duty to use it wisely and to remain connected to the values and principles that had guided my family through generations of challenges. Looking back on the months since discovering the inheritance, I realized that the most valuable gift Ebola had given me wasn't the money or the assets, but the example she had set of how to live with dignity and purpose regardless of circumstance. She had shown me that true wealth came from patience, wisdom, and the commitment to building something meaningful for future generations. She had demonstrated that success could be measured not just in financial terms, but in the impact one had on others and the legacy one left behind. The inheritance had changed my life in ways I was still discovering, but it had also connected me more deeply to my family's history and to the values that had sustained us through generations of challenges. Ebola had spent her lifetime building something that would outlast her own life, and now it was my responsibility to continue that work and to ensure that the lessons she had taught me would be passed on to future generations in turn. 2 years had passed since that transformative Sunday dinner when I revealed the truth about Ebola's inheritance, and as I stood in the newly renovated wing of the Chicago History Museum preparing for the opening of an exhibition I had helped curate, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. The exhibition, titled Hidden Stories: The Untold Wealth of Chicago's Immigrant Communities, featured artifacts and documents from dozens of families who had arrived in the city with nothing but determination and had quietly built legacies that their own descendants often never knew existed. At the center of the exhibition was a display dedicated to Sofia Elena Rodriguez, my grandmother, whose story had inspired the entire project. The museum had provided me with the perfect platform to honor Ebola's memory while also contributing to the broader understanding of how immigrant communities had shaped Chicago's development. Working as the museum's newest curator of immigration history, I had spent months researching families similar to ours, uncovering stories of hidden wealth, secret investments, and carefully preserved cultural treasures that had been passed down through generations. The research had revealed a pattern that I now understood was far more common than anyone had realized: immigrants who had appeared to live modest lives while actually building substantial assets that they carefully protected and preserved for future generations. The opening reception was attended by dignitaries from the city government, representatives from various cultural organizations, and members of the immigrant communities whose stories were featured in the exhibition. But the most meaningful attendees were my family members, who had all come to support the project and to see how I had chosen to honor Ebola's legacy. Michael and Jessica stood near the display about our grandmother, reading the detailed explanation of how she had built her fortune while maintaining the appearance of poverty, and I could see the continued amazement in their faces as they processed the magnitude of what she had accomplished. The exhibition had required extensive research and documentation, work that had deepened my understanding of the immigrant experience in Chicago, and had also helped me develop the expertise and credibility necessary to establish myself as a respected professional in the museum field. The project had attracted attention from other museums, universities, and cultural organizations, and I had been invited to speak at conferences and symposiums about the hidden histories of immigrant community. The work had given me a sense of purpose and achievement that went far beyond the financial security the inheritance had provided. My parents approached the display where I was standing, both of them dressed in the formal attire appropriate for such an occasion. They had struggled the most with adapting to my changed circumstances, not just because of the financial transformation, but because they had been forced to confront their own assumptions about success, achievement, and the value of different types of contributions to society. The guilt they felt about their treatment of both Ebola and me had motivated them to become more supportive and involved in my work, but their efforts sometimes felt forced, as if they were trying to make up for decades of misunderstanding through concentrated attention. Dad paused in front of a photograph of Ebola that had been taken in the 1960s, showing her at work in her small apartment, with fabric spread across her dining table and her sewing machine positioned near the window for better light. "This is beautiful, Emma," he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. You've captured not just her story but the dignity and strength she showed throughout her life. I think she would be proud to see how you've honored her memory and how you've used what she left you to help others understand the value of preserving family history." Mom stood beside him, studying the documents and artifacts that illustrated Ebola's financial acumen and her systematic approach to building wealth while maintaining her modest lifestyle. She had been particularly affected by learning about the decades of careful planning and patient investment that had gone into creating the inheritance, and she had often expressed regret about not recognizing the signs of Ebola's sophistication and success. "Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman," she said, her voice soft with regret. "I wish I had understood that while she was still alive. I wish I had asked her more questions about her life and her experiences instead of assuming I knew what her circumstances were." The conversation with my parents had become easier over time, but it remained tinged with the awareness that our relationships had been fundamentally altered by the revelation of the inheritance. They had learned to treat me with the respect and attention they had always given to Michael and Jessica, but the change felt deliberate rather than natural, as if they had to consciously remind themselves to value my opinions and accomplishments. I had come to accept this as part of the process of rebuilding our family dynamics, understanding that genuine change sometimes required time and continued effort, even when the initial recognition had been dramatic. Michael had arrived at the reception with his wife Sarah, whom he had married the year before in a ceremony that had been very different from the family gatherings of our childhood. For the first time in our family's history, I had been asked to give a toast at a major family celebration, and I had spoken about the importance of recognizing and appreciating the unique contributions that each family member made to our collective story. The wedding had marked a turning point in our sibling relationship, as Michael had finally begun to see me as an equal rather than as someone who needed guidance and protection. His transformation had been gradual but genuine. The inheritance had initially challenged his sense of identity and his understanding of his place in the family hierarchy, but over time he had come to appreciate that my success didn't diminish his own achievement. He had also learned to value different types of accomplishments and to understand that financial wealth was just one measure of success among many. His legal career had continued to flourish, but he had also begun to take on more pro bono cases, particularly those involving immigrant families who needed help navigating complex legal systems. Jessica had completed her medical residency and was now working as an attending physician at a community hospital that served a predominantly Latino population. She had credited our family's experience with the inheritance as one of the factors that had influenced her choice to work in underserved communities, rather than pursuing more lucrative specialty practice opportunities. She had realized that her medical training, combined with her bilingual abilities and her understanding of immigrant family dynamics, positioned her to make a meaningful difference in the lives of people who might otherwise struggle to access quality healthcare. The changes in my siblings had been among the most rewarding aspects of the entire experience. Rather than creating lasting resentment or jealousy, the inheritance had ultimately brought us closer together as we had all learned to appreciate different types of contributions, and to recognize that success could take many forms. We had developed a mutual respect that had been missing during our childhood, when the family hierarchy had been rigidly defined and competition for parental approval had shaped our relationships with each other. Uncle Tom and Aunt Carol had also attended the reception, though their response to my changed circumstances had been more complex and sometimes uncomfortable. Tom had initially tried to position himself as a mentor and advisor, offering investment opportunities and business connections that would have benefited his own enterprise. When I had politely declined these offers and had chosen to work with my own team of advisors, he had seemed somewhat offended, as if my independence was a rejection of his expertise and experience. Over time, however, he had come to respect my financial decisions and my philanthropic work. He had even begun to support some of the same causes that I had chosen to champion, particularly those focused on supporting immigrant entrepreneurs and small business development. His relationship with me had evolved from condescending superiority to genuine collegial respect, though it had taken considerable time for him to adjust to the reality that I no longer needed his guidance or approval. The exhibition opening had also attracted attention from representatives of the Spanish government and from cultural organizations in Spain, who were interested in the stories of Spanish immigrants who had built successful lives in America. I had been invited to participate in a cultural exchange program that would allow me to spend several months in Spain, working with archives and museums there to document the experiences of families who had left during the Civil War and had established new lives in other countries. The opportunity to work in Spain represented the fulfillment of a dream that I had never even known I had harbored. Growing up, I had listened to abuela's stories about the old country with interest, but without really understanding that those stories were part of my own heritage and identity. Now I had the chance to explore that heritage in depth, to contribute to the preservation of cultural history, and to build connections between Spanish and American institutions that were working to document the immigrant experience. The work in Spain would also allow me to continue the research that had inspired the Chicago exhibition, exploring how immigrant communities had preserved and transmitted cultural wealth across generations and continents. I had discovered that Abuela's story was not unique, but rather part of a broader pattern of quiet resilience and strategic thinking that had characterized many immigrant families who had arrived in America with nothing but determination and had built lasting legacies for their descendants. The financial management of the inheritance had stabilized into a routine that allowed me to focus on my professional work while ensuring that Abuela's wealth continued to grow and generate resources for charitable giving. I had learned to work effectively with investment advisors and tax professionals, and I had developed a deep appreciation for the patience and discipline that had been required for Abuela to build her fortune over decades of careful planning and consistent saving. The inheritance had also enabled me to support my family members in ways that would have been impossible when I was working at the coffee shop. I had been able to help Michael and Sarah purchase their first home, to contribute to Jessica's medical school loan repayment, and to provide my parents with the financial security that would allow them to retire comfortably when they were ready. These contributions had felt natural and appropriate, ways of sharing the benefits of Abuela's legacy with the people who had been important to her even when they had not fully understood or appreciated her accomplishments. The philanthropic work had expanded beyond the foundation I had established to include partnerships with other organizations and institutions that were working to support immigrant communities and preserve cultural heritage. I had learned that effective charitable giving required the same patience and strategic thinking that had characterized Abuela's approach to building wealth, and I had tried to follow her example in making thoughtful, sustainable contributions, rather than seeking immediate recognition or dramatic impact. The success of the museum exhibition had opened doors to other opportunities that would allow me to continue building on Abuela's legacy while also establishing my own professional reputation. I had been offered positions at museums in other cities, invitations to collaborate on research projects, and opportunities to write about the immigrant experience for academic publication. The work had given me a sense of purpose and fulfillment that went far beyond the financial security the inheritance had provided. As the reception continued and I moved through the crowd, greeting guests and discussing the exhibition, I reflected on how completely my understanding of wealth and success had been transformed by the experience of inheriting Abuela's fortune. I had learned that true wealth was not just about accumulating money, but about building something meaningful that would outlast one's own lifetime and contribute to the well-being of future generations. Abuela had understood this principle and had lived her life accordingly, working not just to provide for her immediate needs, but to create a legacy that would honor her family's heritage and provide opportunities for her descendants. The inheritance had also taught me about the importance of patience, persistence, and strategic thinking in achieving long-term goals. Abuela had spent over 60 years building her fortune, making countless small decisions and sacrifices that had accumulated into substantial wealth over time. She had demonstrated that success often required the willingness to delay immediate gratification in favor of long-term benefits, and that the most meaningful accomplishments were often those that were built slowly and carefully rather than achieved quickly and dramatically. Perhaps most importantly, the inheritance had shown me that assumptions about people's circumstances and capabilities were often wrong and that true worth was frequently hidden behind modest appearances. Abuela had allowed her family to underestimate her throughout her life, not because she was ashamed of her accomplishments, but because she understood that discretion and humility were often more valuable than recognition and praise. She had taught me that the most important validation came not from others' approval, but from the knowledge that one was living according to one's values and building something meaningful for future generations. The evening concluded with a private family dinner at my townhouse, where we continued to discuss the exhibition and its meaning for our family's understanding of our heritage and identity. For the first time in our family's history, I found myself in the position of hosting and leading the conversation, a role that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier when I was still struggling to find my place in the family hierarchy. As we sat around the dining table that had been crafted by Spanish artisans and had been part of the inheritance, I looked at each family member and reflected on how our relationships had been transformed by the revelation of Abuela's legacy. We had all learned important lessons about the dangers of making assumptions about others, the value of patience and strategic thinking, and the importance of preserving and honoring family heritage. The inheritance had not just changed my financial circumstances, but had also provided all of us with a deeper understanding of what success and wealth really meant. The conversation that evening was relaxed and genuine in ways that our family gatherings had never been before. We discussed our individual projects and goals, shared ideas about how to continue honoring Abuela's memory, and made plans for future family trips to Spain, where we could all learn more about our heritage and the circumstances that had shaped our family's journey to America. The dynamic was collaborative rather than competitive, supportive rather than critical, and focused on building something meaningful together rather than establishing individual superiority. As the evening wound down and family members began to leave, I remained at the table, looking at the family photographs that now decorated my dining room walls and thinking about the journey that had brought us to this point. The dollar bill that had seemed so insignificant 2 years earlier had indeed been the key to everything, just as Abuela had intended, but the real treasure had not been the money or the assets in the Swiss safety deposit box. The real treasure had been the lessons about patience, wisdom, and the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances that had enabled me to understand and appreciate the legacy that Abuela had spent her lifetime building. Standing in my beautiful home, surrounded by artifacts and documents that told the story of my family's journey across continents and generations, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the gift that Abuela had given me. She had not just provided financial security, but had also connected me to a heritage and identity that I had never fully understood. She had taught me that true wealth came from building something meaningful for future generations, and she had shown me that the most important accomplishments were often those that were achieved quietly and patiently rather than those that attracted immediate attention and recognition. The inheritance had changed my life in ways that I was still discovering, but it had also given me the tools and resources necessary to continue the work that Abuela had begun. I was now the keeper of our family's story, the steward of resources that could be used to support others who were working to preserve their own heritage and build their own legacy. The responsibility was both humbling and inspiring, and I was determined to use it wisely and to ensure that the lessons Abuela had taught me would be passed on to future generations in turn. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the exhibition that would open to the public the next day, the research project that would take me to Spain in the coming months, and the ongoing work of managing and growing the inheritance that Abuela had entrusted to my care. The future was full of possibilities that would have been unimaginable when I was working at the coffee shop and struggling to find my place in the world. But more than the opportunities and advantages, I was grateful for the understanding and perspective that the inheritance had provided, and for the connection to family history and cultural heritage that would continue to guide and inspire me for the rest of my life. 5 years had elapsed since that life-changing discovery in Abuela's apartment, and as I sat in the mahogany-paneled boardroom of the Rodriguez Heritage Foundation, reviewing our annual impact report, I marveled at how far we had come. The foundation had grown from a small scholarship program into a comprehensive organization that supported immigrant families, preserved cultural heritage, and created opportunities for first-generation Americans to pursue their dreams without sacrificing their connections to their ancestral roots. The numbers on the page before me told a story of lives changed, families supported, and communities strengthened through the strategic deployment of resources that Abuela had spent her lifetime accumulating. The foundation had awarded scholarships to over 300 students, provided small business loans to immigrant entrepreneurs, funded cultural preservation projects across the Midwest, and established partnerships with universities and museums to document and share the stories of immigrant communities. Each initiative had been carefully designed to address specific needs, while also building long-term capacity for individuals and communities to thrive. The work had required the same patience and strategic thinking that had characterized Abuela's approach to building wealth, and I had learned to measure success, not just in immediate outcomes, but in the sustainable impact that would continue to benefit future generations. The morning board meeting had been particularly significant because we were announcing the establishment of a new international program that would create formal partnerships between American and Spanish institutions to facilitate cultural exchange and collaborative research. The program had been inspired by my own experiences working in Spain and had been developed with input from scholars, museum professionals, and community leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. The initiative would provide funding for researchers, artists, and cultural workers to spend time in each other's countries, building relationships and sharing knowledge that would strengthen understanding between Spanish and American communities. The announcement had attracted attention from media outlets, government officials, and cultural organizations, who recognized the program as a significant contribution to international cultural cooperation. But for me, the most meaningful aspect of the program was the way it honored Abuela's vision of maintaining connections across generations and continents, while building something new and valuable for the future. She had understood that heritage was not just about preserving the past, but about creating bridges between different worlds and ensuring that cultural knowledge could be shared and transmitted to benefit the broadest possible community. The success of the foundation had also brought unexpected recognition and opportunities. I had been invited to serve on the boards of several major cultural institutions, had been asked to speak at conferences around the world, and had been approached by publishers who were interested in my writing about the immigrant experience and the hidden stories of wealth building in marginalized communities. The platform had given me the ability to advocate for policies and programs that would benefit immigrant families, and I had become a respected voice in discussions about cultural preservation, economic development, and social justice. The professional recognition had been gratifying, but it had also created responsibilities that required careful consideration. I had learned that visibility and influence came with the obligation to use them wisely, and I had tried to follow Abuela's example of focusing on substantive contributions, rather than seeking attention or praise. The work had to be about building something meaningful rather than enhancing personal reputation, and I had been conscious of maintaining the humility and discretion that had characterized her approach to both wealth and achievement. My family had continued to evolve and adapt to the changes that had been set in motion by the inheritance. Michael had left his corporate law firm to start a practice focused on immigration law and nonprofit organizations, using his legal expertise to support the same communities that benefited from the Foundation's program. His transformation had been gradual but profound, as he had come to understand that professional success could be measured in terms of social impact, rather than just financial compensation. His marriage to Sarah had strengthened as they had both found ways to contribute to meaningful causes, and they had recently welcomed their first child, a daughter they had named Sophia in honor of the great-grandmother who had made their comfortable life possible. Jessica had completed a fellowship in public health and was now directing a clinic that provided comprehensive medical services to immigrant communities in Chicago. Her work had been recognized by the city health department and had been featured in medical journals as a model for culturally competent healthcare delivery. She had also learned to speak Spanish fluently, a skill that had deepened her connection to the patients she served and had also strengthened her relationship with the cultural heritage that Abuela had worked so hard to preserve. Her personal life had also flourished, as she had married a fellow physician who shared her commitment to serving underserved populations. The changes in my siblings had been among the most rewarding aspects of the entire experience. Rather than creating lasting resentment about the inheritance, the revelations about Abuela's wealth had ultimately inspired both Michael and Jessica to reconsider their own values and priorities. They had both found ways to use their professional skills and advantages to contribute to the same causes that had been important to our grandmother, and our family had developed a sense of shared purpose that had been missing during our childhood years of competition and comparison. My parents had also continued to grow and change in response to the lessons they had learned about assumptions, recognition, and the importance of seeing beyond surface appearance. Dad had retired from his insurance business and had begun volunteering with organizations that provided financial literacy training to immigrant families. He had discovered that his expertise in risk management and financial planning could be valuable to people who were navigating unfamiliar economic systems, and he had found great satisfaction in helping others achieve the kind of security and stability that Abuela had built for our family. Mom had thrown herself into genealogical research, working to document and preserve the stories of other immigrant families who had settled in Chicago. She had developed expertise in archival research and had contributed to several historical projects that had been sponsored by the foundation. Her work had been motivated partly by guilt about not appreciating Abuela's accomplishments during her lifetime, but it had also reflected a genuine desire to ensure that other immigrant stories would not be overlooked or forgotten. She had become a respected volunteer researcher and had been instrumental in several major documentations. The relationship between my parents and me had stabilized into something that felt more genuine and sustainable than the awkward overcompensation that had characterized the immediate aftermath of the inheritance revelation. They had learned to appreciate my accomplishments without the forced enthusiasm that had initially felt artificial. And I had learned to accept their support without the skepticism that had been born of years of feeling undervalued. We had developed a mutual respect based on shared values rather than family obligation, and our interactions had become more comfortable and authentic. Uncle Tom and Aunt Carol had also found ways to contribute to the foundation's work, though their involvement had been more gradual and had required careful navigation of their desire to maintain their status as successful family members. Tom had provided business mentoring to immigrant entrepreneurs who were recipients of the foundation's small business loans, and Carol had organized fundraising events that had brought together Chicago's philanthropic community in support of the foundation's programs. Their contributions had been valuable, but they had also had to adjust to the reality that I was now the family member with the most resources and influence. The dynamics of our extended family gatherings had been completely transformed by the changes that had occurred over the past 5 years. Rather than the competitive displays of achievement that had characterized our childhood family dinners, our gatherings had become collaborative planning sessions where we discussed ongoing projects, shared ideas for new initiatives, and celebrated the accomplishments of the families and individuals who had been supported by the Foundation's programs. The conversations had become more substantive and meaningful, focused on shared goals rather than individual status. The international work had been particularly fulfilling, as it had allowed me to build on the connections I had discovered during my initial research trips to Spain. I had spent several months each year working with Spanish museums and archives, documenting the experiences of families who had emigrated during the Civil War and had established new lives in America. The research had revealed patterns and stories that had enriched my understanding of the immigrant experience and had also provided valuable historical documentation that would benefit future researchers and community members. The work in Spain had also led to the discovery of additional family connections and stories that had deepened my appreciation for Abuela's courage and determination. I had met distant relatives who had remained in Spain, and had learned about the circumstances that had forced her family to leave everything behind. The conversations had provided context for understanding the magnitude of what she had accomplished in America and had also revealed the extent of the sacrifice and loss that had been required for her to build a new life in a foreign country. These discoveries had informed the development of a new initiative that would provide support for individuals and families who were working to trace their genealogies and document their heritage. The program would offer funding for research trips, translation services, and archival work that would help people understand their family histories and preserve those stories for future generations. The initiative had been designed to address the reality that many immigrant families had lost touch with their roots, due to the practical demands of establishing new lives in unfamiliar places. The genealogy program had attracted applications from families across the country who were seeking to understand their heritage and reconnect with their cultural identity. The stories that emerged from this work had been both heartbreaking and inspiring, revealing the resilience and determination that had characterized immigrant communities throughout American history. The program had also created opportunities for intergenerational dialogue, as younger family members worked with elders to document stories and traditions that might otherwise be lost. The success of the Foundation's various programs had created opportunities for partnership with other organizations and institutions that were working on similar issues. I had been invited to participate in national conferences and policy discussions about immigration, cultural preservation, and economic development. The platform had allowed me to advocate for policies that would support immigrant communities and to share the lessons I had learned about the importance of recognizing and nurturing the potential that existed within marginalized populations. The policy work had been challenging but rewarding, as it had required me to translate the personal and family experiences that had shaped my understanding into broader frameworks that could inform public debate and decision-making. I had learned to communicate effectively with government officials, community leaders, and media representatives who were interested in the intersection of immigration, economic development, and cultural preservation. The advocacy work had felt like a natural extension of the Foundation's mission, and had provided another way to honor Abuela's legacy while building something meaningful for the future. The financial management of the inheritance had continued to be a source of both opportunity and responsibility. The careful investment strategies that had been developed during the initial years after the inheritance had been discovered had continued to generate returns that allowed the Foundation to expand its programs, while also building endowment funds that would ensure the sustainability of the work future generations. The wealth had continued to grow, but it had also been systematically deployed to create opportunities and support initiatives that aligned with the values that Abuela had demonstrated throughout her life. The investment philosophy had been guided by the same principles that had characterized Abuela's approach to building wealth: patience, diversification, and a focus on long-term value rather than short-term gain. The portfolio had been structured to generate steady returns while also supporting companies and initiatives that were aligned with the Foundation's mission. The approach had been conservative but effective, ensuring that the resources would be available to support the Foundation's work while also continuing to grow and adapt to changing circumstances. The success of the Foundation had also created opportunities for collaboration with other philanthropic organizations and wealthy individuals who were interested in supporting similar causes. I had been invited to participate in donor networks and collaborative giving initiatives that leveraged the resources and expertise of multiple organizations to address complex social challenges. The partnerships had been valuable for expanding the reach and impact of the Foundation's work while also learning from the experiences and approaches of other philanthropic leaders. The collaborative relationships had taught me about the importance of strategic partnership and the value of combining resources and expertise to achieve goals that would be impossible for any single organization to accomplish alone. The lessons had been consistent with Abuela's approach to building wealth and achieving goals. Success often required patience, collaboration, and the willingness to work steadily toward long-term objectives rather than seeking immediate recognition or dramatic results. As I sat in my office that evening, reviewing the Foundation's annual report and planning for the coming year's initiatives, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The dollar bill that had seemed so insignificant 7 years earlier had indeed been the key to everything, but not in the way that anyone could have anticipated. The real treasure had not been the money or the assets in the Swiss safety deposit box, but the lessons about patience, wisdom, and the importance of building something meaningful for future generations. The inheritance had transformed my life in ways that continued to unfold, but it had also provided me with the tools and resources necessary to honor Abuela's memory while building something new and valuable for the communities and causes that mattered to both of us. The Foundation had become a vehicle for translating her values and vision into programs and initiatives that would benefit people she had never met, but whose struggles and aspirations she would have understood and supported. The work had taught me that true wealth was not measured in dollars or assets, but in the positive impact that one could have on the lives of others and the legacy that one could build for future generations. Abuela had understood this principle and had lived her life accordingly, building financial resources not for personal comfort or status, but as tools that could be used to create opportunities and support the success of others. The inheritance had provided me with the same opportunity, and I had tried to use it wisely and purposefully. Looking toward the future, I could see countless opportunities to continue expanding the Foundation's work and impact. The international programs were attracting interest from organizations and governments around the world. The scholarship programs were generating applications from talented students who would become the next generation of leaders. and the small business initiatives were creating jobs and economic opportunities in communities that had been underserved by traditional financial institutions. The personal satisfaction that came from this work was deeper and more meaningful than anything I had experienced during my years of struggling to find my place in the world. The foundation had provided me with a sense of purpose and direction that went far beyond personal achievement or financial security. It had connected me to a legacy of service and sacrifice that extended back through generations of family members who had worked to build something better for their descendants. As I prepared to leave the office and return to my home, I thought about the family dinner that was planned for the following evening, where we would celebrate the foundation's anniversary and discuss plans for the coming year. The gathering would be very different from the competitive and often uncomfortable family dinners of my childhood, but it would also be a continuation of the tradition of family members coming together to share their experiences and support each other's goals and aspirations. The transformation of our family dynamics had been one of the most unexpected and rewarding aspects of the entire experience. We had learned to appreciate each other's contributions and to work together toward shared goals rather than competing for individual recognition. The inheritance had provided the catalyst for this change, but the real transformation had come from our willingness to examine our assumptions and to build new relationships based on mutual respect and shared value. The evening concluded with a quiet moment of reflection in my study, where I kept some of Abuela's personal belongings and the original documents that had led to the discovery of the inheritance. The dollar bill was framed and displayed prominently, not as a symbol of modest means, but as a reminder of the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and recognizing the potential that often exists in the most unlikely places. The note that had accompanied it was preserved alongside it, a testament to the wisdom and foresight of a woman who had understood that the greatest treasures are often hidden in plain sight. The journey that had begun with that crumpled dollar bill had led to discoveries and opportunities that would have been impossible to imagine at the time. But the most important discovery had been the understanding that true wealth comes not from accumulating resources for personal benefit, but from using whatever advantages one has to create opportunities for others and to build something meaningful that will outlast one's own lifetime. Abuela had spent her life demonstrating this principle, and the inheritance had provided me with the opportunity to continue her work while building something new and valuable for the future. 10 years had passed since that extraordinary moment when I first held the brass key that would unlock the greatest secret of my life, and as I stood before the podium at the International Conference on Cultural Heritage Preservation in Geneva, Switzerland, I felt the profound weight of the journey that had brought me to this moment. The conference hall was filled with scholars, museum directors, government officials, and philanthropic leaders from around the world, all gathered to discuss innovative approaches to preserving and celebrating immigrant stories. My keynote address would focus on the Rodriguez Heritage Foundation's decade of work, but more importantly, it would share the lessons I had learned about the hidden wealth that exists within communities that are often overlooked and undervalued. The invitation to deliver this keynote had come from the Swiss Cultural Ministry, an honor that felt particularly meaningful, given that Switzerland had been the country where Abuela had chosen to safeguard her family's most precious asset. The irony was not lost on me that I was returning to speak in the very city where my life had been transformed by the contents of that safety deposit box. The conference organizers had specifically requested that I address the broader implications of discovering hidden wealth within immigrant communities, and they were particularly interested in the model we had developed for transforming individual financial success into sustainable community impact. As I looked out at the audience, I reflected on the extraordinary decade that had shaped not only my own life, but the lives of thousands of individuals and families who had been touched by the Foundation's work. The Rodriguez Heritage Foundation had evolved from a small scholarship program into an internationally recognized organization with programs spanning 3 continents. We had awarded over 2,000 scholarships, provided seed funding for more than 500 small businesses, established cultural preservation programs in dozens of communities, and created a network of partnerships that connected immigrant families with resources and opportunities that had previously been inaccessible to them. The Foundation's research division had become a leading authority on documenting hidden wealth within immigrant communities, and our studies had revealed patterns that challenged conventional assumptions about economic mobility and asset accumulation. We had discovered that many immigrant families had been building substantial wealth while maintaining modest lifestyles, using strategies similar to those that Abuela had employed. These families had often been overlooked by traditional financial institutions, and had developed alternative approaches to saving, investing, and preserving assets that reflected their cultural values and their understanding of long-term financial security. The research had led to the development of new financial products and services specifically designed to meet the needs of immigrant communities. We had partnered with community banks and credit unions to create savings programs that recognized the importance of sending remittances to family members abroad while also building assets in the United States. We had worked with investment firms to develop portfolios that included international components, allowing immigrant families to maintain connections to their countries of origin while building wealth in their new community. The international expansion of the Foundation's work had been particularly rewarding, as it had allowed us to create programs that addressed the global nature of immigration and cultural preservation. We had established partnerships with organizations in Spain, Mexico, Guatemala, and several other countries, creating exchange programs that allowed individuals to research their family histories, develop their professional skills, and build connections that spanned national boundaries. The programs had been designed to recognize that immigrant communities were not just recipients of services, but were active participants in global networks of cultural and economic exchange. The success of these international programs had attracted attention from governments and international organizations that were interested in developing more effective approaches to supporting immigrant integration and economic development. I had been invited to serve on advisory committees for the United Nations, the World Bank, and several national governments, providing input on policies and programs that would support immigrant communities, while also recognizing the contributions that these communities made to their host country. The policy work had been challenging but essential, as it had provided opportunities to advocate for systemic changes that would benefit immigrant communities more broadly than any individual program could accomplish. I had learned to navigate complex political environments and to build coalitions that brought together diverse stakeholders around shared goals. The advocacy work had required the same patience and strategic thinking that had characterized Abuela's approach to building wealth, focusing on long-term change rather than immediate results. My personal life had also been transformed by the opportunities and responsibilities that had come with managing the inheritance and leading the foundation. 3 years earlier, I had married David Chen, a fellow museum professional who shared my commitment to cultural preservation and community development. David had been working as a curator at the Smithsonian Institution when we met at a conference on Asian American history, and he had brought his own expertise in documenting immigrant experiences to our shared work. Our partnership had been both personal and professional, as we had collaborated on several major exhibitions and research projects that had expanded the Foundation's reach and impact. David's family had immigrated to the United States from Taiwan, and his own experiences with navigating cultural identity and family expectations had given him deep insights into the challenges and opportunities that characterized immigrant communities. His parents had built a successful restaurant business while maintaining strong connections to their cultural heritage, and his family's story had many parallels to the experiences that we were documenting through the Foundation's work. Our marriage had brought together two families with similar values and complementary experiences, creating a partnership that strengthened both our personal relationship and our professional collaboration. The birth of our daughter Sofia Elena Chen Rodriguez 18 months earlier had added a new dimension to my understanding of the importance of preserving cultural heritage for future generations. Named after Abuela, our daughter represented the continuation of a legacy that had been built through decades of sacrifice and patient accumulation. As I watched her grow and develop, I was conscious of the responsibility to ensure that she would understand and appreciate the story of the great-great-grandmother whose wisdom and determination had made her comfortable life possible. The experience of becoming a parent had also deepened my appreciation for the choices that Abuela had made throughout her life. She had lived modestly and worked constantly, not for her own immediate benefit, but to create opportunities for descendants she would never meet. The magnitude of her sacrifice and the far-sighted nature of her planning had become even more meaningful, as I considered the world that I wanted to create for my own daughter and for the children who would benefit from the Foundation's work in the years to come. The Foundation's educational programs had expanded to include initiatives specifically designed to help immigrant families pass on their cultural heritage to their children and grandchildren. We had developed curricula that taught young people about their family histories, provided language instruction that helped them maintain connections to their ancestral cultures, and created mentorship programs that connected them with successful professionals who shared their background. The programs had been designed to address the reality that many immigrant families struggled to maintain cultural connections, while also helping their children succeed in American society. The mentorship programs had been particularly successful, as they had created networks of support that extended far beyond the formal program structure. Young people who had participated in the programs had gone on to establish their own businesses, pursue advanced education, and contribute to their communities in ways that honored their heritage, while also building something new and valuable. The programs had demonstrated that cultural preservation and economic advancement were not competing goals, but were complementary aspects of building strong and sustainable communities. The Foundation's work had also attracted attention from researchers and academics who were interested in studying the long-term impacts of targeted support for immigrant communities. Several universities had established partnerships with the Foundation to conduct longitudinal studies that would track the outcomes of our programs and provide evidence for the effectiveness of our approach. The research had been designed to contribute to the broader understanding of how philanthropic interventions could create lasting change, rather than just providing temporary assistance. The academic partnerships had led to the publication of several scholarly articles and books that had influenced policy discussions and program development in organizations around the world. I had been invited to serve as a visiting scholar at universities in the United States, Spain, and Mexico, sharing the lessons we had learned and contributing to the training of the next generation of professionals who would work with immigrant communities. The academic work had provided opportunities to reflect on the theoretical implications of our practical experience and to contribute to the development of more effective approaches to supporting immigrant integration and success. As I began my keynote address that morning in Geneva, I spoke about the moment when I first discovered the brass key hidden behind the brick on Abuela's balcony, and how that discovery had led to a decade of learning about the hidden wealth that exists within communities that are often dismissed or overlooked. I shared the story of how a seamstress who appeared to live in poverty had actually been building a fortune through decades of careful planning and strategic investment, and how that discovery had challenged everything my family had believed about success, wealth, and the value of different types of contributions to society. The audience was particularly interested in the lessons we had learned about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and recognizing the potential that often exists in the most unlikely place. I spoke about the hundreds of families we had worked with who had been building assets and preserving cultural heritage, while maintaining modest lifestyle, and how supporting these families had created opportunities for economic development and cultural preservation that benefited entire communities. The presentation concluded with a discussion of the future challenges and opportunities that would shape the work of supporting immigrant communities in the coming decade. I spoke about the need for more sophisticated approaches to recognizing and nurturing the wealth that already existed within these communities, and the importance of building partnerships that would leverage the resources and expertise of multiple organizations and sectors. The work would require the same patience and strategic thinking that had characterized Abuela's approach to building wealth, focusing on long-term sustainability, rather than short-term results. The response to the keynote was overwhelmingly positive, with audience members expressing interest in developing similar programs in their own countries and communities. The conference organizers had arranged for follow-up meetings with representatives from several governments and international organizations who wanted to explore partnerships with the Foundation. The discussions had the potential to lead to significant expansion of our work and to the development of new approaches to supporting immigrant communities around the world. That evening, as I walked through the streets of Geneva toward the hotel where David and Sophia were waiting for me, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this point. The city looked different to me now than it had during my first visit to claim the inheritance, when I had been overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I had discovered, and uncertain about how to proceed. Now I understood that the real treasure had not been the money or the assets in the safety deposit box, but the opportunity to build something meaningful that would honor Abuela's memory while creating lasting benefits for others. The decade of work with the foundation had taught me that true wealth was not measured in dollars or assets, but in the positive impact that one could have on the lives of others and the legacy that one could build for future generations. Abuela had understood this principle and had lived her life accordingly, building financial resources not for personal comfort or status, but as tools that could be used to create opportunities and support the success of others. The inheritance had provided me with the same opportunity, and I had tried to use it wisely and purposefully. As I entered the hotel and took the elevator to our suite, I thought about the future challenges and opportunities that would shape the next decade of the foundation's work. The international programs were attracting interest from organizations and governments around the world. The scholarship programs were generating applications from talented students who would become the next generation of leaders, and the small business initiatives were creating jobs and economic opportunities in communities that had been underserved by traditional financial institutions. The personal satisfaction that came from this work was deeper and more meaningful than anything I had experienced during my years of struggling to find my place in the world. The foundation had provided me with a sense of purpose and direction that went far beyond personal achievement or financial security. It had connected me to a legacy of service and sacrifice that extended back through generations of family members who had worked to build something better for their descendants. The evening concluded with a quiet moment of reflection as I looked out the window at the city lights of Geneva, thinking about the family dinner that was planned for the following week back in Chicago, where we would celebrate the foundation's 10th anniversary and discuss plans for the coming decade. The gathering would include not just my immediate family, but also dozens of scholarship recipients, small business owners, and community leaders who had been supported by the foundation's programs over the year. The celebration would be a testament to the power of patient investment and strategic thinking, and to the importance of recognizing and nurturing the potential that exists within every community. The transformation of our family dynamics had been one of the most unexpected and rewarding aspects of the entire experience. We had learned to appreciate each other's contributions and to work together toward shared goals, rather than competing for individual recognition. The inheritance had provided the catalyst for this change, but the real transformation had come from our willingness to examine our assumptions and to build new relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the dollar bill that was still framed and displayed prominently in my office back in Chicago, not as a symbol of modest means, but as a reminder of the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and recognizing the potential that often exists in the most unlikely places. The note that had accompanied it was preserved alongside it, a testament to the wisdom and foresight of a woman who had understood that the greatest treasures are often hidden in plain sight. The journey that had begun with that crumpled dollar bill had led to discoveries and opportunities that would have been impossible to imagine at the time. But the most important discovery had been the understanding that true wealth comes not from accumulating resources for personal benefit, but from using whatever advantages one has to create opportunities for others and to build something meaningful that will outlast one's own lifetime. Abuela had spent her life demonstrating this principle, and the inheritance had provided me with the opportunity to continue her work while building something new and valuable for the future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.